You're listening to the Aviation RC Noob podcast, episode 100, part 2, where Joe and I sit down and talk with Albion Bowers about the experimental X-15 aircraft. Our quick history. I'm going to read some things that you can probably find on some other public sources, so I apologize. But the biggest thing is that Al, I think, has some stories to tell about the X-15, but we're going to talk today about the North American X-15. It is the hypersonic rocket-powered aircraft that was operated by the United States Air Force and NASA, National Aeronautics Space Administration, as part of the X-plane series, giving a bunch of tests to different experiments and creating an experimental aircraft. It set the speed and altitude records in the 1960s across the edge of outer space and returned with valuable data that we used in creating aircraft and spacecraft design. Its highest speed was 4,520 miles per hour. That is a little over 2,000 meters per second. And that is effectively, it was achieved on October 3rd, 1967 by William J. Knight, who flew at Mach 6.7 at an altitude, which is almost as impressive, of 102.1 feet or 19.3 miles, literally in space.
Yeah, it's
literally in space. It set the official world record for the highest speed ever recorded by a crewed powered aircraft, and it remains unbroken today. During this program, there were 12 pilots who flew a combined total of 199 flights. Of these, 8 pilots flew a combined 13 flights, which met the Air Force space flight criteria, which by exceeding an altitude of 50 miles. So thus, all of those folks qualified those pilots as being astronauts. Of those 13 flights, 2 of them were flown by the same civilian pilot, met by the FAI, which is the World Air Sports Federation, defined and met those definitions of outer space by that group. The 5 Air Force pilots qualified for military astronaut wings immediately, while the 3 civilian pilots were eventually awarded the NASA astronaut wings in 2005, 35 years after the X-15 flights. The last of those flights. That's what I'm going to read. There are so many in aiming to achieve this record, which is basically making a giant rocket, strapping somebody to the front of it, and sending them to space, more or less. What's interesting is basically rather than launch it from the ground, it was attached to a B-52 that was specifically designed or repurposed for this. It was launched, I don't know what, about 30,000 feet or 45,000 feet, I believe, 45,000 feet. And then it was released and the rockets were ignited. And then it basically had a somewhat vertical trajectory out into the outer orbits. It had bow thrusters that were genuinely rocket thrusters because there is not enough air molecules in that outer band of Earth space to really do any kind of controlling. So they had thrusters to maintain attitude and direction, though there were control surfaces. Let's see. The propellant was really wild. I'm trying to remember what the propellant was that I think I wrote it down over my personal notes as well as. Do you remember what it was, Al?
I do not recall. You'd have to go look it up.
Yeah, it's a liquid nitrous oxide, helium purger, and a liquid hydrazine, I think is what it was. Some sort of crazy chemical. Um, trying to
Anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen.
liquid oxygen, yeah.
It looks
Yeah.
like rah saying.
it,
I'll be relying on you
there it is.
to monitor the chat because if I go and open that, it's going to throw all my
Yeah,
big no
it's
off.
anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen. Now the ammonia is, of course, the really crazy toxic thing when it hasn't reacted.
Makes you
But
think of that German plane from.
that's what I was. That's what I was thinking. Well, so and that's really part of the interesting thing with that. Um, I think there was a large lesson learned from the part of the reason why when they launched it in the air at 30,000 or 45,000 feet off of a bomber. Because if they, part of the difficulty of taking off with that aircraft, the German, why can't I think of the 262? No, it wasn't 262. The one,
163.
is it 263 or was it the 163?
163.
ME 163, right? And that had such a volatile mix of fuel components that if it messed up at all on takeoff, the thing essentially just exploded right then and there,
Well, the
right? And
Messerschmitt.
then, yeah, the Messerschmitts. And then if you didn't use all the fuel, landing was just as dangerous, right? So I mean, you you really just wanted to use it until it turned into a brick, and then sort of glided that brick to the ground and hope that there was no fuel left when you landed. Which is, I mean, there's more to it, but I mean, that's what I took from our history of that one. Was that now?
So I know two of the pilots who flew 163s during World War II. One of them was Rudy Opitz, and he had flown one of the Hortons in the United States after the war, and but Rudy was the squadron commander when they went operational with those. And one of the young guys that was flying for him was a gentleman named Wolfgang Fengler. And
Okay.
he was the great uncle of some friends that, friend of a friend, and through this thing down at UCLA. Anyway, he came up and visited us at our
Oh wow.
place. And he just an amazing individual. And he was 16 years old, had only flown gliders before he flew the
Oh my.
163. And he said the most difficult thing was when you ran out of fuel, because then you had to figure out how to get back down on the ground. And you've just flown through the formation of the bombers and made a mess out of that. And now you have the P-47s are chasing you.
Yeah, that's
And
because you started
so
the hornet's nest, right?
exactly, you smacked it with the baseball bat.
And now you got to come back
He
through it.
he said the one thing that you could do to outrun the P-47 was point the nose straight down. He said you go as fast as you can straight down to burn off all the altitude, and then you try and get there far enough ahead of them that you can land, get out of the thing, and run away before they come flying over the field.
Wow.
And he was 16 years old when this happened. He flew 38 combat missions and survived 38 missions.
That's incredible.
You know, 16 years old.
Wow.
It didn't even compute to my brain when he's telling this story.
Right.
And just this old guy, with his glasses and Uncle Kurt,
Yeah. And he's telling the story like, oh my gosh, you should have seen it. We went faster than anybody had ever been, punching through the American, front and trying to bust it up. That's so crazy.
I want to make a
Um,
terrible reference here, but hearing that story and thinking about him at 16 makes like the country song. Terrible, I know, but that country song, should have seen it in color, comes to mind.
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Just I can't imagine being 16 and doing that.
I know, right? I mean, Al, when you showed me a picture, and I see you got a glider in your background, a hang glider. What age were you hang gliding? You said it was like 13 or something, right?
Yeah, I built my first hang glider, started when I was 12, and I turned 13, and it was like 6 weeks past my 13th birthday. And my dad took me down to the beach and tossed me off of this sand dune. And the whole concept of landing directly into the wind to reduce your, the delta V just as you were touching down hadn't, computed yet.
Oh no, right?
So,
Yeah.
so my first flight, I ate a lot of sand. Um, the photo that you saw is actually my second flight.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll make
and
sure we put this in somewhere in our
okay,
thing.
and
Go ahead.
and that was just a soft landing, and it wasn't until about 20 minutes after that photo I made my third flight, and that was my first on the feet stand up landing.
Wow,
Um,
nice.
yeah,
But now, okay, now knowing what you knew back, at 13, flying your first couple goes, right? Imagine a couple years later, just as you're trying to figure out a car, right? Being like, hey, by the way, strap yourself into this volatile rocket engine and punch through those bad guys up there, right?
right, right.
you know? And then, by the way, you got to make it back here and get out of it before they find you. You're like, what? That's, I mean, a whole different world.
Yeah.
I'm going to go over a couple quick things about this aircraft that I think there's so much about it. All I can do is urge somebody to go and look at any of the documentaries. Most of them are done really well. We'll link to a couple of them. The tail. We talked about one of the pieces. The tail literally gets jettisoned before it lands because it doesn't have any wheels on the bottom. It has skids. It has two front wheels and it has skids in the back to land on. And so the skids can't be that long. So the tail on the bottom that keeps it pointed in the forward direction, the bottom half of it pops off basically, so it can land on a shorter piece of tail or land just off it, and then they replace that. So it's like a sacrificial thing. But I what I think is interesting, there's like, there's too many. But one, the front edge is a blunt ball. It is not a point. It is not a little sticker or whatever. It's a blunt ball to create the bow wave shock edge that goes beyond the shape of the plane so that the skin friction, doesn't become too much. Correct me, please, Al, if I've got it wrong.
So
Because
ball
it's
is
already
actually
going Mach 6 point whatever, and the skin friction
0.7,
is
yeah.
already more than most materials can handle. You didn't need to add to it. So they're like, well, let's put this thing on the front and hopefully we'll reduce the amount of friction overall. And that might be able to keep it so that we don't burn everything to pieces.
Well, the ball is actually Inconel steel. Okay, so very high temp steel, very strong. But the ball, the thing that most people don't realize about that ball, and it's about it's a little bigger than a cue ball. And by the way, it was called a cue ball, uh, letter Q ball. And
Nice.
the reason they did that was because it had 5 holes drilled in it. And as they would read the pressure off of each of those holes, it would try and drive the deltas between left and right and top and bottom to 0. And the reason that they would drive that ball straight into the wind, so then you knew what the angle of attack was on the aircraft and the angle of side slip.
Right.
That was the instrumentation for reading angle of attack and angle of side slip on the vehicle.
Right. So it's almost like a pitot tube, but very close together and very tiny.
Yes.
Because at Mach 6, it's already going so fast, you don't really need much area to be able to tell the difference. Right? You don't need much delta to really get what you need. That was really cool. Yeah, that's the cool one of the pieces of that ball. I appreciate you going through that, because that's a critical piece, because that tied into all the control centers of it. Because it was computer controlled, right? Or assisted? Stability augmented.
It was stability augmented, yeah.
So that that was a new thing, right? Like, so here you got using Inconel, right? Using that ball to create the cone. Well, that was sort of discovered. This was definitely like tested there. The pre-cooled rocket fuel that basically used the rocket fuel to cool the nozzle, which they do nowadays. Nowadays, like, oh, that's what you do, right? But back then, not too many people were, they're trying to figure out how do we, one, heat up the fuel so the ignition delta isn't huge. Also, how do we reduce the temperature of the nozzle so it doesn't just melt? And the answer is put the fuel through it, which is pretty cool. So that you'll see, if you look at a picture of the nozzle at the back, they have a number of fins, and those fins are literally to pump the fuel around. But the interesting part was the fuel that was pumped with a completely separate system. Like the turbochargers, I think were fueled or powered by a totally different fuel system.
Turbo pumps, yeah.
Yeah. And so they were using like two different systems to actually get that to run, which isn't, you'd think, oh, it would be a lot more efficient to just use the same fuel and use the same stuff to just power the pumps. Like, well, nah, not quite. And then the turbo pumps had to move, they had to pump at different rates because you had to make sure that the oxygen was flowing at a different rate than the other, the anhydrous ammonia. So that was pretty cool. And then there was the glass. Right? It basically quartz, just solid quartz. And if I recall, I can't remember. They had a shield on the one side.
Yes.
That literally was a fire shield, and then the other side was, I think, open so they could at least see something, right? And when they landed the one time, because of the expansion, the thermal expansion of the different pieces of the metal, is before I think they had encapsulated the whole thing. The pressures from the deltas of the heat and the expansion and the rigidity of the container of the window basically caused it to completely shatter. Only the outer shell, not the inner shell, thankfully.
Right.
Which
it turns out that they had not figured out that the coefficient of thermal expansion of the airframe versus the quartz was so far off that it compressed the quartz and shattered the quartz.
Yeah. Right. And then they looked at different using different metals, because it was Inconel, right? Inconel expands a lot less, but not as much as, like, titanium is a very different animal than Inconel, which is very different than aluminum or steel. And when you're putting something like this together, they all have very different strengths too. Inconel is incredibly, I think it had almost no thermal expansion. It was incredibly strong, but it was also crazy expensive, and they had to use it in like sparing bits because they couldn't just put it across the whole thing, but they had to have it. Otherwise, parts of it would just, come to pieces or whatever. It just, I don't know. It's really cool. There's so many new pieces that they used for all of the project, the SR-71, the space shuttle, right? All the cooling tiles, and among the other things of like how things thermally expand and don't, re-entry, all that stuff was the fuel systems, the rocket engine, like all those things were components that were brand new, as well as some of the augmented controls. They were testing all of those things at the same time, pretty much.
Well, yes. Well, something you need to remember,
not entirely, but mostly.
This is before there was solid state electronics for a lot of this.
Oh, wait, yeah.
They were running tube amps.
Just
so
right.
Early
like,
on,
wow.
it was tube amps that were on board this thing. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought you said two bamps. I was chuckling about that.
It's yeah.
So
I'm gonna sum up. Really, please look this up. Learn about it. Check it out, because there's so many details I'm missing. I'm only covering the big bulk of it, right? There's so much detail in this. Do you
I've
have a
got to
story
tell,
that you can share? Yeah, tell me
but
when.
real quick about
take your
the
time.
thermal expansion. It turns out that the outer airframe would get very hot, and so it would expand. Well, remember the fuels for the rocket motor are cryogenic, so they're very cold. Well, there was
Right.
this tube down the middle, okay, and what they had done was they would actuate the two skids in the back of the aircraft and the mains. And then
Hmm.
there was a cable that went all the way to the front that would actuate the nose wheel. Well, the first time they went Mach 4 with the aircraft stretched, but the cable, the steel cable, shrank because it's running through
Because
this.
it's next to the freezing.
Right,
Was a hydrogen,
exactly.
right?
Okay, so the nose gear comes down
Right.
at
No,
Mach
liquid
4.
oxygen, right? Like it's like liquid compressed liquid
It-
liquid.
It's the liquid oxygen.
Right.
So the
Very cold. It's like 170 degrees. No, wait, what is it? Kelvin. So it's negative 100 degrees C, right? Very cold.
so Mach 4 and the nose gear comes down. And so you're trying to do this, slow down, you're going Mach 4, and the tire and all the hydraulics and the rubber seals um the suspension are all hanging out in the breeze, and they land on the thing, and it's like, okay, so you pull the lever. They're accusing the pilot of having bumped the lever, the landing gear lever, and he's going, I did not touch it. And they had a cockpit movie that you could actually watch, and it turns out the pilot didn't touch it. And there were like 3 or 4 times where the nose gear comes down as they're going through Mach 4. And so they finally figure it out, and so they put slack in the line later on so that they wouldn't end up actuating the nose gear. But the best part was they actually put a placard on the landing gear and said, "Do not deploy above Mach 4."
Right.
Don't
Nice.
deploy at Mach 1.
I
Right?
mean, right, but it's a nod to the guy who they yelled at probably for a while until they realized what's going on. Like, don't pull the darn lever. Like, I'm not pulling the lever. I'm sure it goes a little bit more calm than that. But oh, and that's the other thing is they had an ablative coating, right, for reentry.
They
So
did well for the Mach 6.7 one, yeah. They did.
right, and so it was basically coated pink and then painted white. And then when
Right.
it came back, there's sections of the plane that are this bubbly black mess, which is the ablation of the heat shielding, basically.
Right.
Um, and
It
it's
would
I
just
think
char off, and they'd have to
yeah,
cut it all off and
yeah,
put new ablative on. Yep.
So it had to be
yep.
repainted, redone between every flight, essentially.
Yeah.
At least in certain areas, yeah, definitely.
Mm.
It reminds me a lot of there's a fire retardant coating that we put on steel for buildings, and it's basically a paint that it's I want to call it intumescent paint, and it basically expands as it heats up. It's almost like that those little snakes you light, and then they expand and they come out and they look like a snake or whatever as kids. It's basically like that across. So you just paint it on your steel.
Right.
And then when there is a fire, it turns into this, it expands, and then that thickness creates an insulation and it keeps the steel from melting
Hmm.
and lets the fire do its thing. It's really expensive, but when you're out of solutions, it's a solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, very cool. All I can do. There is so much on it. Like, look at the shape of the tail. It's not what you'd expect. But again, tons of things. Look it up. It's one that would be if you had a bunch of rockets that you just wanted to play with. This is a model you build as an RCer, and then just hit the button like, come on, and then watch it go, and hopefully you can
Right.
recover it. Right?
Yeah, throw a
Yeah, a lot of
Class
fun.
D motor in that.
Exactly.
Can we take a second to reflect on the insanity that was like the 50s and 60s? Uh, the work that Al, you, and so many others did, the things y'all are working on, and to know that we've not a lot of that stuff we haven't really gone back to, like this. We've not gone back to it. We've not topped it. At least in manned flight. Now it was insanely expensive, sure, but just looking back and hearing what as a country and even as a world we did 60, 70 years ago and just kind of left on the table.
Yeah.
Or that was the edge of what can be done until more technology even than we have is obtained.
Yeah.
Like, it's nuts. You guys were crazy.
Well, wait, now Al's not. I don't know. Al's, you're not that old, right?
No, I'm not.
No, you don't. Like, you might have been born maybe.
No, I'm not.
You're,
I don't mean. I shouldn't. I apologize. I should not, because I'm assuming that in my mind I'm sticking that Al was working on the X-15, and I'm so sorry, Al.
No.
No, I'm not.
I am so
No, but
sorry.
he knows a lot of guys. You've talked to a bunch of
did.
guys who were, right?
I did. And
That's-
the amazing thing was, and this was very typical of NASA, is you give the young people a lot of responsibility right up front, and you let them run with it. And
Yeah.
it was so amazing to here I was, only like 3 or 4 years into my career, and I'm ending up with all this responsibility of being a lead in this area and being responsible for these things.
Right. What was? Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, keep going. I'm sorry. I'm about to jump ahead, and I shouldn't.
Okay.
Sorry, keep
Well,
going.
there's something very fundamental that's going on, and the X-15 is significant because it is one half of that sort of problem. The space race is going on at this point, and
Right.
you have the spam in a can solution that is leaping forward, whereas the airplane people just thought airplanes would go faster and higher and faster and higher until eventually they just go off into orbit.
Right.
And that, of course, never happened. Okay. I mean, we've talked about it, but we've never gotten there. We've never been able to do that. And there was this expectation that the aircraft would eventually get there. And in the meantime, the capsule on the big expendable rocket was the answer. And it was like a paradigm shift for the airplane people. And they got left behind. And this is why you stop and think about people like Chuck Yeager. Yeager never went to try and become an astronaut. And the reason was he thought that the airplanes would eventually get there. And all the people that followed after him were the same way. But if you were one of those people who was further down the food chain, you knew you'd never get there because all these other really brilliant guys were in front of you. And so the young guys,
they'd move over to the opportunity.
Exactly.
And then they were given a ton of just try it, buddy. Because honestly, what do we have to lose at this point?
They had to solve that problem. There's there's 4 stories about Neil Armstrong, or really, you would call them emergency incidents that happened to him. All 4 of them were landing problems. So the first 3, he was trying to land on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the night with no lights.
And, oh yeah, I heard about that.
Okay, so he figures
was it in the fog too? Like it was like
no, but because he was able to see in the blackness below him bioluminescence in the wake of the carrier, and that was how he found the carrier.
Wow.
Okay, and no lights. Second one was the X-15. He has this huge overshoot during the reentry, and so he ends up overflying Pasadena. Okay, missing Edwards, overflies, and he's all the way over the LA basin before he finally gets turned around.
Which is on the other side of the mountains, on the east side of California.
Yeah, and so he's trying to stretch his glide back to Edwards. He just makes it at the other end.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, all the X-15 flights, we're talking about how fast and how high it went.
Right.
You have to stop and think about this. And Milt Thompson and Bill Dana were friends of mine, and they were X-15 test pilots. You can go look them up.
Mm-hmm.
And um, they Milt used to joke that the X-15 was the only airplane that you were glad when the motor quit. Because when you dropped off the rails on the B-52 and lit it, it was 2.5 Gs eyeballs in. Then the fuel would burn off. The thrust stayed the same. So you'd at burnout, you were 4 Gs eyeballs in. And then it would quit 90 seconds into the flight. And so all of a sudden you're at 0 G, and for the rest of it you're on this ballistic flight.
Yeah.
And by the way, and then you do the reentry, and now you're trying to do the terminal area energy management. You end up doing the heading alignment circle so that you end up on the lake bed to figure out to come out on the lake bed runway and touch down and land and stop. And from the time you dropped from the B-52 till the time you were stopped on the lake bed was less than 10 minutes every time.
10 minutes to go all the way to the edge of space and back.
And yes,
And cover what,
300,000 feet.
half of the distance of America, right?
Yeah. I mean, they'd be all the way up Wendover, Utah, before
Yeah.
they drop off, and then they come all the way back. You're doing that in 10 minutes every single time. And you look at 198 flights, and they're all less than 10 minutes, except for Neil Armstrong's flight, which is 12 minutes and 9 seconds. And it's because he had to stretch the glide. So, and then of course, everybody knows the lunar lander, the jet powered, has a computer failure, and Neil has to eject about a second and a half before it impacts the ground. And then, so now you dump this guy in a lunar module, and he pitches over and he's looking at a boulder field. And he's got to figure out how to land this thing. You've given this guy 3 times where he's landed the thing in almost impossible circumstances. Which guy do you think is going to land on the moon? That's the guy.
It's an incredible person. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the only
a different breed, man. A different breed is all I can say.
Well, I mean, some of it is like I didn't. You don't have a choice, right? He's also right. If I remember right, I want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding. Is Yeager the one who's the engineer and the pilot and the astronaut and all that stuff, or was it? No, Yeager was not the astronaut.
Oh, he was not an engineer.
Okay, and it was Armstrong who was the. Yeah. And he was just heavily involved in all the things pretty much all the way until he couldn't. Yeah. And he wasn't just like, let me test, but it's like, no. What did you do? Where are your calculations? I want to see what's going on. How does that work? Show me over there. He wasn't just like you want me to fly it today? Okay, cool. I'll get in and I'll do it. He was involved by all tell. Yeah. Which is pretty cool. I mean, honestly, I can't say I wouldn't be a whole lot different. I mean, it's like, no, really show me what you did. My life is on the line as well as all these people's livelihoods. Let's make sure this goes right. I think the only other thing where we have a manned aircraft that goes much faster is really the space shuttle on reentry, right? It's coming in at Mach 25, but this is the only one that's been powered, and we'll call it flyable. I use the terms flyable, which it is. It's under full control. But so anyway, yeah, that's the X-15. Go look it up. I appreciate your input, Al. That's definitely some interesting stories. I figured you'd have some interesting insights that I know, Joe or I definitely wouldn't have. So we have a giveaway today, and we will have a giveaway for those who are listening in our YouTube channel later. So today, if you are listening on our Discord channel and you've been a member of that community, you've had an opportunity to submit questions to Al or for Al to answer later. We are going to take one of you at random, and you are going to win a Gladiator, which is a flying wing from Windcatcher RC. So I could also say that this episode is sponsored in part by Windcatcher RC. Go to Windcatcher RC for all your carbon fiber and aeronautics paraphernalia. I don't know. They've got a lot of great stuff there. What's that?
Needs.
Yeah, exactly. He is one of the leading carbon fiber suppliers for a number of different kit makers in the United States, as well as kites and things like that. So, but his inventory extends well past that. So if you have anything that you are thinking about, go over there and see what he's got, because it's almost always a really good price. Lee is an excellent supporter of the hobby, supporter of us in particular. He's helped us out with a handful of little things here and there, and honestly, he's a great guy. So if you can, go over there, see what he can help you with. But we have 2 Gladiator kits we're giving away. One today, near the end of the show. Just listen in and you'll hear it. And then we will give the details on how you can do that later in the show. About when we post this to YouTube, we're going to have a way that you can participate, and then we will choose whoever's participated on YouTube. We'll select one of those at random, and then we'll give them a kit.
Yeah, and I think the reason for YouTube, one, we like this will be in a video format, but also it's a central platform.
It is, and it's our 100th episode. It's our 100th episode.
It only took us how many years to get here?
Let's not talk about that, Joe.
Well, real quick, before we move on to your history segment, speaking of sponsors, thank you, Lee from Windcatcher RC. Also, thank you to our patrons who continue to support us and help us keep the lights on. Things have been slow lately, but thank you for sticking with us, and hopefully soon things will start picking back up again. So
yeah, we really appreciate those who've continued to support us along this journey as we go during I'll call it this slowdown as we kind of reorient what we're doing. But more importantly, like again, if you're listening and you have been as you get into this hobby, we really appreciate that you listen. We appreciate that you join the Discord. The community there is excellent. So I want a big shout out to our Discord community who've really kind of been amazing ambassadors for new people in the hobby. And also, if you want, consider joining our Patreons. If your support at Patreon helps keeps the website going and the lights on, and us looking forward to doing really dumb, stupid, fun projects that we have in the background here.
like the giant Noob Wonder.
Like the giant Noob Wonder. Woo!
2 motors.
Yeah, it's a twin. Actually, I've recovered that video. So I'm going to be posting that soon. So look for that on YouTube.
I didn't know you lost the video.
Well, remember the whole computer crash?
Right.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that were hard to find. So
okay. Fair enough.